and welcome to our training today. My name is Lori Eldridge-Font, and I work with the Nutrition and Physical Activity Division here at the Alabama Department of Public Health. During this presentation, I will be talking about disability in the after-school programs. Did you know that people with disabilities make up our nation's largest minority group? 1 in 5 Americans has a disability. It's also the most inclusive and most diverse group containing all ages, genders, religions, ethnicities, sexual orientations, and socioeconomic levels. It's the largest minority group that anyone can join at any time, at birth or later, through an accident, illness, or the aging process. Just think about it. Today, as you were driving over to this presentation or walking to a room to watch this presentation, you could have slipped and fallen. Had you hit your head and suffered a head injury, you could join this group. It's that easy to get into. Contrary to the beliefs and opinions often expressed by society, individuals with disabilities are not people who suffer from the tragedy of birth defects, afflicted, struggle to become normal again, nor are they victims who fight to overcome their challenges. They are people, moms and dads, sons and daughters, employees and employers, friends and neighbors, students and teachers, scientists, reporters, doctors, actors, presidents, and more. People with disabilities are people first. They do not represent the stereotypical perception of a group called the handicapped or the disabled. Each person is a unique individual and should be treated as such. So as we're talking about disabilities today, you may be thinking, is there a universally accepted definition of disability? And the answer is no. The Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as ADA of 1990, has a definition for disability that is widely recognized by many different groups and programs, and it's most likely the definition that you have used in the after-school setting. The ADA uses the term disability to mean a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities of such individual, and having a record of such impairment or being regarded as having such an impairment. So it's not necessarily just having the disability, but having a record of it and also being regarded as having that disability. And there's also another definition of disability that I like to use. The Centers for Disease Control conducts a telephone interview to look at prevalence rates of disability. And so what you're looking at on the screen are the definitions for the way that CDC defines disability through the Burfess survey. And one is a person is defined as having a disability if they self-report that they are limited in any way in any activities because of physical, mental, or emotional problems, or if they have any problem that requires the use of special equipment such as a cane, a wheelchair, a special bed, or a special telephone. And as you're probably aware, there are many different types of disabilities, which include those involved with hearing, vision, movement, thinking, remembering, learning, communicating, mental health, and social relationships. Do you know somebody, or do you work with somebody, or somebody in your family have a disability? Most likely your answer is yes, because as I mentioned earlier, 1 in 5 Americans has a disability, so it's very, very difficult to go through life without having a disability or knowing somebody who has a disability. What I'd like to do is talk about some of the prevalent disabilities that are found in the after-school setting. Developmental disabilities are a group of conditions due to an impairment in physical, learning, language, or behavior areas. These conditions begin during the developmental period and usually last throughout a person's lifetime. 1 in every 6 children in the United States has 1 or more developmental disabilities. Here's a listing of different types of developmental disabilities, most of which you have likely seen within your after-school program. They include attention deficit hyperactive disorder, autism spectrum disorders, cerebral palsy, hearing loss, intellectual disability, learning disability, vision impairment, and other developmental delays. You most likely have worked with a child who has been diagnosed with one of these types of developmental disabilities within your after-school program. One prevalent developmental disability is attention deficit hyperactive disorder, or ADHD as it's more commonly called, and this is one that you may be seeing quite often in the after-school setting. Did you know that 1 out of every 6 kids are diagnosed in Alabama with ADHD? It's a pretty significant statistic. Also, too, children with ADHD may have trouble paying attention, controlling impulse behavior, may act without thinking about what the results will be, or may be overly active. And I'm wondering, are you seeing more kids with ADHD in your programs? I'm going to talk a little bit later about how this prevalence rate is increasing, and the odds are that you are seeing more and will continue to see more kids being diagnosed in this area within your after-school programs. Autism spectrum disorders are a group of developmental disabilities that can cause significant social, communication, and behavioral challenges. 1 in every 50 children in the United States has been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And here's a statistic that may surprise you. The majority of children with autism spectrum disorder do not have an intellectual disability. Lots of times we hear that people just make assumptions that somebody with a developmental disability may also have an intellectual disability, and that's simply just not the case. Autism spectrum disorders are spectrum disorders, meaning just that. It affects each person in different ways. So if you know one child with autism spectrum disorder, you know one child, because each child on the spectrum has different, they have unique and different ways of acting. So you cannot assume that every child on the autism spectrum disorder will act or behave in the same way. And here are some alarming statistics. Let's look at some of the disability rates that are rising over the years. Over the past 12 years, some of the prevalence that we've seen increases in are developmental disabilities by 17%. And look at this statistic. Autism rates have increased by almost 300% over the last 12 years. And attention deficit hyperactive disorder has also increased by 33%. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have not noticed an increase in kids with these particular diagnoses within your after-school programs, you most likely will see an increase because the statistics are going up, so the odds are the number of kids coming into your after-school programs will continue to be diagnosed with these particular developmental disabilities. Okay, on the slide you can see 3 different pictures. And what I'd like to do is talk about the attitudes that we have about people with disabilities and language that we often use. So what I'd like for you to do is look at the 3 pictures. If you're looking at this presentation by yourself, I'd like you to jot down what you see in each one of these 3 pictures. If you're watching this presentation with some friends, other coworkers, then I'd like for you to pair up and talk to each other about what you see in each picture. And then after you discuss this or jot down your notes, I want you to keep this in mind because we're going to come back to these pictures later in the presentation. How many of you have heard this saying as a child? Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Isn't this one of the biggest lies that we learn as a child? Ask any overweight junior high teen if it hurts if he or she is called fat. Or ask any child who struggles in school if it hurts if he or she is called slow. And I think you'll quickly learn just how powerful that these words can be. This saying simply is not true. As we grow older and mature, we begin to recognize that words are powerful. language is powerful, and labels are powerful. And old, inaccurate words and inappropriate use of medical diagnoses just continue to perpetuate negative stereotypes and reinforce attitudinal barriers towards individuals with disabilities. All right, let's look at a slide that helps illustrate people first language, because this is the topic that we're switching into. And I think this slide does a great, or presents this in a very good light. If you can read, the adult is saying, so what do you prefer to be called? Handicapped, disabled, or physically challenged? And the individual sitting in the wheelchair says, Joe would be fine. And the caption reads, the most appropriate language is usually the one people's parents have given to them. People First language helps those who don't live with a disability recognize people with disabilities as individuals with personalities and identities that are distinct from their disability. The most basic and effective use of the language is to identify people with disabilities by their names. Let's look at some of the examples of People First language. And this is a chart. If you look, there's two columns. In one column, we have listed the language that we've often heard people use and continue to hear people use. And then in the other column, we have a more appropriate way to say what's being said on the left-hand side. So instead of saying the handicapped or the disabled, you would say people with disabilities. Instead of saying normal, healthy, or able-bodied, you would say people without disabilities or a typical person. Instead of saying she is wheelchair-bound, confined to a wheelchair, you would say something like Susie uses a wheelchair or a mobility chair, because most people that I know that use a chair are not confined or bound to the chair. They can move in and out of the chair, and so it's inappropriate to say that somebody's bound or confined to a chair. We would not say birth defect or affliction. Instead, we would use a congenital disability. And we would never call somebody mentally retarded. We would say, Joe, Susie has a cognitive disability. Oftentimes in school systems and after-school systems, it's pretty common to hear somebody say, oh, that kid's special ed or an inclusion student. The more appropriate way to say this is Mary receives special ed services. And the reason why we say this is that a person is not their label, right? We would not want to identify ourselves as being special ed, because if Mary receives special ed services, we want to recognize Mary as the person first and then the diagnosis afterwards, because the person comes first. And here are a few more examples that I'd like to review with you. Instead of saying he is crippled or quadriplegic, we would say Bobby has a physical disability. Again, we're putting the person, Bobby, first before the diagnosis, physical disability. How about she is learning disabled? No, she's not learning disabled. Debbie has a learning disability. She is developmentally delayed. No, Jenny has a developmental delay. Again, we're placing the person first and the diagnosis second. And please know that appropriate people first language is an evolving process, so it's a good idea to stay informed about the changes. There's some language or appropriate ways that we may say something today, and in 6 months down the road, that language may change. So it's a really good idea to stay on top of checking out websites or checking out resources that provide the appropriate language to use so that you are always using people first language correctly. And I would like to talk about a few exceptions to using people first language. Saying the deaf and the speech of the deaf violate the person first rule. However, the community of persons who are deaf prefer to use deaf with a capital D to denote the deaf culture and the deaf community, not the hearing loss. The same can be said for those individuals who are blind. Now I'd like to go back to the 3 pictures that we looked at a few minutes ago and ask again, now what do you see? So again, what I'd like for you to do if you're watching with other individuals is to pair off and describe to each other what you see in each one of these 3 pictures. If you're watching this presentation by yourself, I'd like for you to again jot notes and write what you see in each one of these pictures. And my hope is that as we just talked about people first language, as you're looking at these pictures, maybe you're seeing them in a new light. And maybe you're seeing or thinking about more appropriate ways to describe what you're seeing in the pictures. And once you get your ideas jotted down or you describe what you're seeing in these pictures to the other people, think, has your language changed? Did you find any areas where maybe you weren't using the most appropriate people first language? And I'd just like to point out that using proper language shows respect and care to people with disabilities. And it's one way to begin earning the trust of parents that you serve through your after-school programs. Okay, and as you begin to practice people first language, be cautious of others using inappropriate language, especially the media, such as websites, newspapers, and television, because it's one area where I've particularly noticed that people first language is oftentimes not used, although the media is getting much better with using people first language. Here's one example. This picture that you're seeing made worldwide news in 2013. It was taken at a Canadian elementary school, and when it was sent home with the boy in the picture who uses the wheelchair, his mother was quite upset and asked for a new picture to be taken. The news media picked up coverage of this picture and posted it, and the original picture went viral and was covered by mainstream media. Here are examples of headlines used with the picture that you just viewed. And again, thinking about people first language, let's see if these headlines use people first language. So if we look, one of the first titles read, "Wheelchair, class photo didn't mix, disabled boy almost edged out." And this was a newspaper headline. Does this headline use people first language? And can this headline be improved? And if you look right underneath it, is a better way to title this particular article and picture. It reads, "Miles Ambridge, 7-year-old in wheelchair, isolated by photographer in class picture." So that is a better way of stating what was stated in the first headline, right? We're using the young boy's name and we're saying he's a 7-year-old in a wheelchair. We're not calling him disabled, so it is a better way and it's more proper use of people first language. What about this last headline? "California authorities continue to search for autistic, very inquisitive girl." Does this headline use people first language, and can it be improved? Okay, so let's talk about inclusion. What is inclusion? Inclusion of kids with disabilities into after-school programs is an effective way to ensure that all kids are treated equally. Inclusion is being a part of what everyone else is, being welcomed and embraced as a member who belongs. It is not setting a child off by themselves like what we just saw in the class picture, or separating a child with a disability away from the rest of their peers. It is treating everyone as a member who belongs. So students with disabilities who participate in classroom have academic gains in a number of areas, including improved performance on standardized tests, mastery of individualized education goals, higher grades, improved behavior, and increased motivation to learn. And the bottom line is that inclusion benefits all kids, not just kids with disabilities. We also know from research and studies that students with disabilities who participate in after-school programs have higher academic achievement, improved school attendance, higher aspirations, improved social competence, and improved behavior. So I just want to comment that what you do and what you provide in after-school programs is so important for all kids, not just kids without disabilities, but for all kids. And please keep in mind that inclusion is a right and a process that requires flexibility on your part. There are 3 federal laws specifically that apply to children with disabilities and support their ability to learn in schools and school-related environments. The 3 laws are the Americans with Disabilities Act, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and Section 504 of the Rehab Act. I'm not going to go into each one of these laws, but I do want to make the point that it's very important that you know about these laws. You know that these laws can possibly impact and affect what you do in the after-school program, and I encourage you to get familiar with each one of these laws and know how it impacts your program. So what are some of the potential problems that we see in schools and programs that work with children with disabilities? With some of the potential problems are children with disabilities are not considered in decisions that affect all children and students. Oftentimes after-school programs or other programs plan programs for children without disabilities, and they just don't take into consideration the needs of all kids, and that does create problems. Oftentimes we see there are low or no expectations for students with disabilities. Earlier I mentioned that many people make the assumption that if somebody has a disability, they also have a low IQ, and that's simply not the case. And so because of that and because of those inaccurate assumptions, there are no expectations or low expectations for students with disabilities. And again, that creates a problem. Another problem is stereotyping by label and categorical placement. And what this means is a school may take all children that's on the autism spectrum disorder and assume they're all going to act the same way. And remember, I said autism spectrum disorder is a spectrum disorder and that all kids are different, and we cannot assume that every child that has the same diagnosis is going to behave the same way, is going to act the same way, is going to interact the same way. So this does create problems. Another potential problem is false perceptions that children must be ready instead of classes and programs being ready for students. After-school programs should be ready for all kids. It should not be that you have your program set up and that you're going to work with a parent and work with the kids to get ready for you. It should be the other way around. And then lastly, another potential problem is that teacher preparation does not adequately address inclusion of students with disabilities. And oftentimes, when we've gone into programs or we've worked with groups of kids, we may see a child who has been diagnosed with one of the disabilities that I've mentioned that may be placed off on the side because maybe that child does not interact or behave the same way as the other kids. Instead of the programs learning how to interact with this child and find how to get the child included, then that child oftentimes is placed aside from everybody else. And again, this creates a problem. So what are some of the possible solutions when including children with disabilities into your program? What I'd like to do is take a few minutes and talk about some of the possible solutions that we have found to be very helpful in working with children with disabilities. One is to provide inclusion games and anti-bullying games on the first day of a program. As providers, you can structure your program so that kids can play games that build teamwork and decrease the likelihood of bullying. And inclusion games and anti-bullying games are basically games that all kids would be playing together. And it's one way to, if you'd like to to think of it this way, to force all kids to play and interact with each other so that kids can get to learn each other rather than kids segregating themselves and then not interacting in a positive way. And keep in mind, too, that kids with disabilities are bullied much more often than other kids, and so anti-bullying games and inclusion games can help address this as well. Another possible solution is modeling respect for all. Remember to use people-first language. Providers should serve as role models in modeling language. So if you're working with other teachers, other instructors, other daycare providers, child care providers that may not use people-first language, if somebody says that autistic child, you can say, "You mean Susie?" And if adding the diagnosis is pertinent to the conversation, then you would say, "Susie with autism." You would not say that autistic child. It's very important to just model the appropriate behavior. And sometimes, too, you may hear a parent that uses inappropriate language, not really knowing, the right way to use people-first language. And so it is okay to model that language for parents as well. It's also important to protect confidentiality, and extremely important not to talk about kids with disability in front of others or not at all. And I can tell you from personal experience through the years, because I've had a child that grew up and went to after-school programs for years, that I did hear instructors and teachers talking about other kids who had been diagnosed with a developmental delay, talked about in front of other parents. And I am sure that if the parent of that child that was being talked about had heard what was being said, they would not have been very happy about it. So it's just really, really important to protect confidentiality. And it's also important, too, to let parents know that you protect the confidentiality of the children, because it is their right to ask that you keep things and you handle their business in a confidential way. It's the way that we would all want to be treated. And then another possible solution is celebrating strengths and abilities by knowledge and awareness of each child. When we place a label on a child, like calling someone a special ed kid, we don't recognize the individual strengths and weaknesses. So it's really, really important not to place those labels on kids and to get to learn each one of the kids that you work with as an individual. And think about it. Would you want to be known as Susie the diabetic, Susie the hypertensive? We don't go around calling adults by some diagnosis that they may have been given. So why do we do it with kids? It's extremely important to get to know a child, find out their strengths and weaknesses. Ask kids what they like to do. Ask kids what their favorite activities are. Find out what are the kids' challenges. And especially if you have a child who may be having difficulties and which may then turn into some type of behavioral issues, when the child is calm, when the child is happy, when the child is around their parents, ask the child about challenges that they may have and find out how that child would like to be interacted with during one of these difficult or challenging times. Find out what makes the child excited, upset, and frustrated. And then that way you can interact and treat that child as an individual. Also, too, we would like to provide, another solution is providing modifications and accommodations. And I would like to show you one of the board games that we have used and has been modified. And this is just an example. I'm not necessarily promoting this game, but I found my daughter was very, very hyperactive growing up. In our household, we played many board games, played many games, to add a variety of interests. And so this was one of our favorite games. But one of the problems that we had was that we would have each one of these cards placed on the board. And then when my daughter was much younger and she went to place another one of these cards on the board, she would knock it and all the cards would go flying everywhere. She would get frustrated, and that would end the game. So one of the things that I did, and this is a great solution for some of the games, activities that you may have, is to add Velcro. And if you can see, I added a little piece of Velcro on each one of these squares right here, and I added a Velcro piece on the back of each one of these pieces. That way, when we put the board game in place, it stays in place. And that prevented lots of tantrums, meltdowns from the board game going away when all the pieces were knocked off. And I've made other modifications like this. So this is just an example of one of the modified activities that you can do. Some of the other modifications is, say if you're doing physical activity with kids, you can get a larger bat with a larger ball. That way, a child who may have difficulty swinging a bat or a child who may not have good eye-hand coordination can hit a ball with a bat much more easily. And one of the other ways to modify activities is allow kids to work together. Pair up and teach. Let the kids teach each other, because sometimes that's the better way for kids to learn, is to learn from another child. And also, too, one of the other possible solutions is to provide respectful accommodations. What you may want to have is an area that kids can get up and move to if they feel like they need to just get up and move and wiggle and get some of the energy out, or even a safe place to go. You may have a blanket that's spread out in a corner of a room, and that's an area that kids may know that they can go to and either dance, move. You can have items such as a jump rope there, or other things that kids can do, hula hoops, so that they can kind of wiggle and move and get that energy out. Or you can have another designated area that's a safe area, and that may be an area where kids go to, and when teachers see a kid in that safe area, it may be a clue for a teacher to go over and ask the child if they need assistance in some way. And I've seen some programs have a blanket where if a child wants to play with another kid, and there's no other kids that are wanting to play with the child, then the child moves over to this safe area or an area where other kids know if a child's standing in that area that they want to play with somebody. And then the instructors, teachers can send a child over, team those kids up together so that we don't have any kids that are not being included as part of the team, as part of the group, because we want to promote inclusion. Some of the other ways to provide respectful accommodations is if a child doesn't know how to play a game, assign a peer to run with them. You may have a child who can hit with a larger bat or a larger ball, but then they don't know to run to first base. So what you can have is another child standing with the child who is batting, and when the child hits the ball, both kids run together to first base. So this, again, is just a good way for kids to teach one another. And if you do this, then you want to pair up all kids. You don't want to just pair up kids who have disabilities because that would sort of single those kids out. So you want to make these types of modifications and accommodations for all kids. And one of the other things that you can do is use instruction cards. Take a picture of how to play a game and then put those pictures together and sit and show the child the steps in how to play a game, either a sports game or some game like Yahtzee that I showed a minute ago. Okay, what I'd like to do now is show you some items in what I call a go-to bag, or a bag of tricks. And this basically is a bag that you can have in your center, or when you go out on a field trip, you can take this bag with you, and it may provide some items to help calm a child, to help distract a child, to help a child get their behavior better under control. Okay. So if you work with kids who have disabilities, oftentimes we see that there are many kids who may have sensory issues, And so sometimes those kids may be sensory seekers. So some of the items that I have in the bag are things that would feed a sensory diet. So we have just a ball of yarn. You can have pipe cleaners that can be twisted, felt. I have other items like crinkly paper, because not only does this feed the sensory diet of hearing, then kids can hear and get the sensory input of hearing. This piece of paper, also too, I'm going to move this. We have some kids who, when they're sensory seeking, may touch items that may not be appropriate. And so if you provide other types of items that a kid can get the sensory input from, then it may decrease the amount of sensory seeking that may be going on in other areas. And so this is basically, it's a piece of fur. And if you've got a child that's a sensory seeker, let's say that child is playing football and would be needing that sensory input, they could put a little piece of fabric in a pocket that nobody else can see, and that way if they need the sensory input, they can feel the fabric. I also have felt, just another piece of fabric that provides other types of sensory input. Some of the other items that I like to keep in the bag is a chalkboard with chalk, because you may have a child who may have communication or speech delays. And so this child may do better writing or drawing pictures or writing notes rather than speaking. So this is a good item to have just to help those kids better communicate. Bubbles. We all know as a doll, if you sit and you blow bubbles, it oftentimes provides a relaxing feeling. So if you have a child whose behavior is flaring up, blowing bubbles may help to calm that child down. One of the other items that I like to keep in the bag are pairs of earplugs, because oftentimes too, if you have kids who have sensory issues, who may get sensory overloaded by loud noises, especially in some of the old gyms that we see around the state, by providing a child with a pair of earplugs, they can oftentimes block the noise that they're receiving. And then you get better behavior out of those kids. Also, too, there's some kids, say, if their balloon's blown up, there may be items that a child is very fearful of going around. And so if they're wearing earplugs, then oftentimes that child may be more agreeable to go into areas that are noisier or may potentially cause problems. I also have other types of balls, squeezy balls, bouncing balls, all items that you can go to help. And then chalk. And then one of the other items is something like a type of silly putty. This one glows in the dark. All things that can feed a sensory diet. Okay, so that is the go-to bag, or the bag of goodies that we recommend that you keep with you. One of the other possible solutions is to support positive behavior, because what we know is behavior is communication, right? What can behavior communicate? Behavior from kids and other adults can let you know that they're bored, tired, hungry, or sleepy. When we're out doing presentations and I look out across the room and adults are starting to kind of wiggle and move in their seat, it lets us know that they're feeling a bit anxious and ready to get up and move. So behavior communicates very, very well. One of the other ways that you can support positive behavior is using a concrete schedule. And I'm going to go to the side camera once more to show you one other item that can be used. Let's see. When we're transitioning, or we're working with kids on their schedule, what we know is that, let's see, kids do like a concrete schedule. And so oftentimes when you have a new child, or even children that oftentimes don't don't adapt very well to changes in the environment, when that child comes into your program at the beginning of each day, you could have something like this that lists different blocks, and then you've made little icons of the different types of activities that that child has the possibility of doing. So in this example, my different icons say reading class, art class, recess, and math class. So what I can say is, okay, Joe, today, what would you like to do first? So the child was given the opportunity to pick, doesn't like math, but he knows if he gets math done, then he'll enjoy the rest of the different activities for the rest of the day. So we're going to do math first, and then we're going to have recess. And then I'd like to do reading class, and then I'd like to go on to art class. So later in the day, after Joe has done his math class, and he starts asking questions about what he's going to do next, or getting a little bit nervous about how the rest of the day is going to go, you can pull your chart out and show Joe the planned activities for the day. That way he knows exactly what he's going to be doing during the day, and it really cuts down on some of the anxiety that he may be having. Okay, and then one of the other ways that we can support positive behavior is to prepare kids for transitions. And this is something that I've done within my own family quite a bit. 30 minutes before you need to get out of the pool, give a, hey, heads up, 30 minutes, everybody's out of the pool. In 15 minutes, hey, heads up, 15 minutes, everybody's out of the pool. Because we know, usually, when kids are swimming or doing some type of activity, it's really hard sometimes to get everybody out of the pool and moved on to somebody, to another activity. So if you count down, the kids know that, we're about to transition. And then also, too, there's always some kids that have a harder time transitioning than other kids. And so those kids that have the toughest time transitioning, you may want to give them some leadership opportunities. And what I mean by that is have that child be the leader that goes and rounds up all the other kids. Have that child, let's say if you're out on the soccer field, have that child be the one that goes out and collects all the soccer balls. Or in the pool, they may collect all the noodles in the pool. That way it gives that child something to do, and it helps transition that child from one activity to the next. Okay, and then another solution is to work with the families. And really, working with families of children with disabilities is key to successful inclusion. Realize that you set the tone of your working relationship with parents right from the first meeting, so make it a good one. Ask parents who know their children's behavior the best about how to handle difficult behavior. Families are the experts on their kids, so really go to the experts for advice. Ask the families how to address a child's behavior. Ask parents about previous experiences with after-school programs and learn from those experiences. If a child had a difficult experience or a challenging experience in another program, ask about what happened. Ask about the solutions that were presented, how it worked, because you may be dealing with some of the same challenges. And so really, it just like in all other walks of life, it's really important to learn from previous experiences. And then finally, recognize that parents are doing the best that they can do. The support that you provide to them is so very beneficial and important. And parents really appreciate the services that you provide. They really appreciate you watching after their kids, because oftentimes the time that you watch their kid or their child may be the only time that they actually get a break during the day. So the work that you do is so extremely important. All right, and I would like to close today with a quote from actor Chris Gorham that I think is very insightful. And he said, "I don't think of him as my son with Asperger's. I think of him as my son. He's not wrong. He's not broken. He is who he is. we, as his parents, are going to do our best, as we do with all of our kids, to give him the best shot at having the best life he can. And I think through this quote, you get a really good glimpse of a parent's perspective. And I hope it reminds us all to always treat a child as a child and not one who has been given a diagnosis that needs to be fixed, and realize that all children deserve the opportunities to have the best life that they can have. Along with parents, you are important in helping each child reach their full potential. And with that, this concludes the presentation. And I'd like to put up the slide that lists my contact information. If you have any questions or would like any additional information, please contact me by either phone or email. We would love to work with you and provide those resources. And I'd like to thank you so much for your participation in this program today. Thanks again for your time.